Before we begin this powerful story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The morning mist clung to the Georgia countryside like a shroud, thick and suffocating in the humid air of 1858. Through the windows of Blackwood Manor, the pale light filtered across mahogany furniture and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who had built their fortune on the backs of human bondage. Colonel Marcus Blackwood stood at his study window, his weathered hands gripping a crystal tumbler of bourbon. At 52, he was a man accustomed to absolute control over his vast cotton plantation, over the 300 souls he claimed as property, and over the fear that kept them in line. His steel-grey eyes surveyed the fields where rows of white cotton stretched toward the horizon, tended by figures bent under the merciless sun. The Blackwood name carried weight throughout Georgia. Marcus's grandfather had carved this plantation from virgin wilderness, and his father had expanded it into one of the most profitable operations in the state. 3 generations of Blackwoods had ruled this land with iron fists, and Marcus intended to ensure that tradition continued for generations to come. But this morning, something was different, something that made his jaw clench and his knuckles whiten around the glass. The previous evening had been like any other. The enslaved people had returned from the fields as the sun set, their bodies exhausted from 14 hours of back-breaking labor. They had eaten their meager rations of cornmeal and fatback, tended to their children, and settled into their cramped quarters for another night of fitful sleep. The overseers had made their final rounds, checking locks and counting heads, ensuring that Blackwood's valuable property remained secure. Everything had seemed normal, too normal perhaps. "Master Blackwood, sir," came a trembling voice from behind him. He turned to see Thomas, his overseer, a wiry man with nervous eyes and a perpetual sheen of sweat on his brow. Thomas had been with the plantation for 15 years. Working his way up from a common field hand to his current position of authority. He was a man who understood the delicate balance of fear and respect that kept the plantation running smoothly, which made his current state of agitation all the more concerning. "What is it, Thomas? Speak up." "Sir, we got ourselves a problem, a big one." Thomas wrung his hat in his hands, his knuckles white with tension. 3 of them ran off in the night. Samuel, the young one called Moses, and... He paused, swallowing hard, as if the words themselves were dangerous. "And the giant." The crystal tumbler slipped from Blackwood's fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Bourbon splashed across his polished boots, but he didn't notice. His face had gone pale, then flushed red with a rage that made the veins in his temples throb visibly. "The giant." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of thunder. "You're telling me that 7-foot monster is loose in my county?" Thomas nodded miserably, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed nervously. "Yes, sir. Found their shackles cut clean through. Someone had tools, sir. Good ones. Professional quality, not some makeshift file or broken piece of metal. This was planned, sir. Planned careful-like." Blackwood's mind raced through the implications. Escape attempts were not uncommon. Desperate people would always try desperate things, but they were usually poorly planned affairs, driven by emotion rather than strategy. Runaways typically fled on impulse, taking nothing but the clothes on their backs and hoping to reach the north before the dogs caught their scent. This was different. This showed forethought, preparation, outside assistance. "How many others know?" Blackwood demanded. "Just me and the night watchman who found the empty quarters. I told him to keep his mouth shut until we figured out what to do." "Good. We keep this quiet until we bring them back. I won't have word spreading that Marcus Blackwood can't control his own property." The giant, whose real name was Josiah Freeman, had been on his plantation for 8 years, bought at auction in Charleston for an astronomical sum because of his size and strength. At nearly 7.5 feet tall, With shoulders broad as a barn door and hands that could snap a man's neck like a twig, Josiah was worth 10 ordinary field hands. He could pick more cotton in a day than any 3 men combined, could lift fallen trees that would require a team of oxen to move, and could work from dawn to dusk without showing signs of fatigue. But more than his physical power, it was something else about the giant that had always unsettled Blackwood. Unlike the other enslaved people who kept their eyes downcast and their voices hushed, Josiah had never truly submitted. Oh, he worked. Lord knows he worked harder than any 3 men combined. But there was something in his dark eyes that spoke of an unbroken spirit, something that whispered of dignity that no whip could strip away. Blackwood had tried everything to break that spirit. Extra work details, reduced rations, public whippings that left scars across the giant's massive back. Nothing worked. Josiah endured it all with the same quiet dignity, never crying out, never begging for mercy, never showing the fear that Blackwood needed to see. It was as if the man existed in a different world, one where Blackwood's authority meant nothing. "Tell me exactly what you found," Blackwood said, forcing his voice to remain calm. Thomas pulled out a small notebook and consulted his scrawled handwriting. "Night watchman made his rounds at midnight. Everything normal. Made them again at 3 o'clock. Found the quarters empty. Shackles were cut through with some kind of metal saw. Clean cuts, no filing or grinding. No signs of struggle, no blood, nothing disturbed, except they were gone." "What about the other slaves? Did anyone see anything?" "That's the strange part, sir. Nobody's talking. Usually, when someone runs, the others are scared, jumpy, looking for ways to prove their loyalty. But this morning," Thomas shook his head, "it's like they're all holding their breath, waiting for something." Blackwood felt a chill run down his spine. In his experience, enslaved people only acted that way when they believed change was coming. Real change, not just the temporary disruption of a failed escape attempt. "How long?" Blackwood demanded. "Best we can figure, they left sometime after midnight. The dogs lost the scent at Miller's Creek, but that was hours ago. They could be anywhere by now, could have help waiting, fresh horses, supplies." The possibility of outside assistance made Blackwood's blood boil. There were rumors of underground railroad activity in the area, whispered stories of abolitionists helping slaves escape to the north. He had always dismissed such talk as northern propaganda, but now he wondered if he had been naive. Blackwood strode to his gun cabinet, withdrawing a double-barreled shotgun and a Colt revolver. His movements were precise, practiced. This wasn't his first hunt for runaways, but it was the first time the giant had run, and that changed everything. The shotgun was a custom piece, crafted by a gunsmith in Savannah, specifically for hunting dangerous game. The revolver was a newer model, accurate at long range and deadly at close quarters. Blackwood had used both weapons to kill men before, and he would not hesitate to use them again. "Saddle my horse," he commanded, "and gather the men, all of them. Tell them to bring the dogs and extra ammunition." "Sir, maybe we should contact the sheriff." "No!" Blackwood's voice cut through the air like a blade. "This is my property, my responsibility. I'll not have word spreading that Marcus Blackwood can't control his own slaves. We handle this ourselves, and we handle it today." As Thomas hurried away, Blackwood checked his weapons with methodical care. Each bullet, each powder charge was inspected and loaded with the precision of a man who had never missed his target. He had built his reputation on swift, brutal justice for any who dared defy him. Runaway slaves were returned in chains, or not at all. The truth was, Blackwood's reputation extended far beyond his own plantation. Other slaveholders looked to him as an example of how to maintain order, how to keep valuable property from developing dangerous ideas about freedom. If word got out that 3 of his slaves had successfully escaped, especially if the giant was among them, it could inspire copycat attempts throughout the county. That could not be allowed to happen. But as he prepared for the hunt, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a question he didn't want to acknowledge. What do you do when your prey refuses to run? 20 minutes later, Blackwood emerged from the manor to find 8 men waiting in the courtyard. They were a rough collection: overseers, slave catchers, and local men who made their living from the misery of others. Their horses stamped impatiently, while a pack of bloodhounds strained against their leashes, eager for the chase. Pike, the grizzled slave catcher, spat tobacco juice into the dirt and adjusted his rifle. "Morning, Colonel. Heard you got some runaways need collecting." 3 of them, Blackwood confirmed. 2 boys and a man. The man is special. "How special?" asked Johnson, another of the slave catchers. Blackwood paused, considering how much to reveal. These men were professionals, but they were also gossips. Whatever he told them would be repeated in every tavern and trading post within 50 miles. "Big," he said finally, "very big and dangerous." "Listen up," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. 3 slaves ran off in the night. 2 of them are just boys, scared and stupid, but the third—" He paused, letting his words sink in. "The third is the one they call the Giant, 7.5 feet of muscle and bone, and mean as a cornered bear." One of the men, a grizzled slave catcher named Pike, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Hell, Colonel, how hard can it be? Big as he is, he'll leave tracks a blind man could follow." "Don't underestimate him," Blackwood warned. "Josiah Freeman is no ordinary runaway. He's smart, he's strong, and he's got nothing left to lose. That makes him dangerous." The truth was, Blackwood knew more about the Giant's past than he let on. 8 years ago, when he'd purchased Josiah at the Charleston slave market, the auctioneer had whispered the man's history. Josiah had been born free in Pennsylvania, educated by Quaker missionaries. He could read and write, skills that were forbidden to slaves, but impossible to erase from a man's mind. He'd been kidnapped while traveling south to search for his wife and children, who had been sold into slavery years earlier. The slave catchers had drugged him, forged papers claiming he was a runaway, and sold him at auction. For 8 years, Josiah had endured bondage while never stopping his search for his family, and now he was free again, somewhere in the vast Georgia wilderness. "Mount up," Blackwood commanded, swinging into his saddle. "We ride hard and we ride fast. I want them back before sunset, dead or alive." The hunting party thundered out of the courtyard, dogs baying and horses' hooves pounding against the packed earth. Behind them, the enslaved people of Blackwood Plantation watched from the fields and quarters, their faces carefully neutral, but their hearts racing with a mixture of fear and hope. As they rode toward Miller's Creek, where the trail had gone cold, none of them noticed the figure watching from the edge of the woods, a massive silhouette that stood perfectly still among the trees, waiting. The hunt had begun, but the Giant was no longer running. He was ready to make his stand. The bloodhounds led them through dense underbrush and across muddy creek beds, their baying echoing through the Georgia pines like the voices of demons. For 3 hours, the hunting party followed a trail that seemed to lead deeper into the wilderness, away from the main roads and settlements where most runaways would head in their desperate flight to freedom. Blackwood rode at the front of the group, his face grim with concentration and growing frustration. The morning sun had burned away the mist, revealing a landscape of rolling hills covered in thick forest. This was dangerous country, full of ravines, caves, and hidden valleys where a man could disappear for weeks. It was also Cherokee land, technically, though the government had relocated most of the tribe 20 years earlier. Some had remained, hiding in the deep woods, and they had no love for white slaveholders. The possibility that his runaways had found sanctuary with Cherokee holdouts made Blackwood's jaw clench even tighter. The Cherokee had a long history of harboring escaped slaves, treating them as free men rather than property to be returned. If Josiah and the others had made contact with a Cherokee band, they could be halfway to Tennessee by now, following ancient trails that no white man knew. "Colonel!" Pike called out from ahead, his voice cutting through the morning air. "Dogs are acting strange." Blackwood spurred his horse forward to where the slave-catcher knelt beside the creek. The bloodhounds were whining and circling, their noses to the ground, but their usual enthusiasm gone. They seemed confused, almost frightened, as if they had encountered something that challenged their understanding of the world. These were experienced tracking dogs, bred specifically for hunting human prey. They had followed countless trails over the years, through swamps and forests, across rivers and mountains. Nothing should have been able to confuse them so completely. "What is it?" Blackwood demanded, dismounting to examine the scene himself. Pike stood up, scratching his grizzled beard with dirty fingernails. "Trail just stops. Right here at the water's edge. But it ain't like they crossed over. The dogs would pick up the scent on the other side. It's like they just vanished into thin air." Blackwood knelt beside the muddy bank and examined the ground with the eye of an experienced tracker. There were clear footprints leading to the water, 2 sets of smaller prints that belonged to Samuel and Moses, and one massive set that could only belong to the giant. The prints were deep and clear, pressed into the soft earth with the weight of men moving quickly but not carelessly. But Pike was right. There was no sign they had crossed the creek. The opposite bank showed no disturbance, no footprints emerging from the water, no broken vegetation where men might have climbed out. "They doubled back," suggested Johnson, one of the other slave catchers. "Walked in the water to throw off the scent. Old Indian trick." "For how long?" Blackwood asked, his voice tight with frustration. "This creek runs for miles in both directions. They could have come out anywhere, or they could still be in the water moving downstream toward the Savannah River." The Savannah River was 20 miles away, but if the runaways had help, boats, supplies, fresh clothes, they could reach it by nightfall. From there, they could disappear into the network of rivers and swamps that stretched all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. As if to emphasize the problem, the bloodhounds continued their confused whining, unable to pick up any trail, despite their handlers' increasingly desperate urging. The dogs had been trained from puppyhood to follow human scent through any conditions, but something had broken their ability to track. "Could be they used something to mask their scent," Pike suggested. "Pepper, maybe, or some kind of herb." Blackwood nodded grimly. That would require knowledge and preparation. Further evidence that this escape had been planned with outside help. The question was, who was helping them, and how much did they know about his operation? "Split up," Blackwood ordered. "Pike, take 3 men and follow the creek upstream. Johnson, you take the rest and go downstream. Search every inch of both banks. Look for any sign they came out of the water. I'll search the immediate area for clues we might have missed. We meet back here in 2 hours." As the groups dispersed, their voices fading into the forest, Blackwood found himself alone for the first time since the hunt began. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the gentle murmur of the creek and the distant call of a mockingbird. He tied his horse to a sturdy oak and began examining the ground more carefully, looking for any sign the others might have missed. The forest around Miller's Creek was old-growth timber, with massive pines and oaks that had stood for centuries. The canopy was so thick that little sunlight reached the forest floor, creating a twilight world of shadows and whispered sounds. It was the kind of place where a man could lose himself completely, where the normal rules of civilization seemed to hold no sway. Blackwood had always prided himself on his tracking skills, learned during his youth hunting deer and bear in these same woods. But as he searched the area around the creek, he began to feel something he had rarely experienced: uncertainty. That's when he found it, a single footprint in a patch of soft earth, 50 yards from the creek. It was enormous, easily size 16, and pressed deep into the soil with the weight of a man who stood nearly 8 feet tall. But what made Blackwood's blood run cold wasn't the size of the print. It was the direction it was facing. The footprint pointed back toward the plantation. "Impossible," he muttered, but even as he said it, he felt a chill run down his spine. No runaway slave would double back toward their master's property. It would be suicide, madness, the act of a man who had lost all reason. Unless they weren't running at all. The thought hit Blackwood like a physical blow. What if this wasn't an escape attempt? What if it was something else entirely? A trap, perhaps, or a deliberate provocation designed to draw him away from the plantation? But that was impossible. Slaves didn't set traps for their masters. They ran, they hid, they begged for mercy when caught. They didn't turn and fight, didn't challenge the natural order of things. Did they? Blackwood drew his revolver and began following the trail of massive footprints. They led through the forest with purpose, not the desperate, zigzagging path of a fleeing man, but the steady, determined stride of someone who knew exactly where he was going. The trail wound between ancient trees and over fallen logs, following what seemed to be an old deer path that had been used for generations. Blackwood had hunted these woods since childhood, but he had never noticed this particular trail before. It was subtle, almost invisible, unless you knew what to look for. As he followed the prints, Blackwood began to notice other signs of passage. Broken twigs at exactly the right height for a 7-foot man, disturbed leaves that had been carefully replaced, but not quite perfectly. Someone was leaving a trail, but doing it so skillfully that only an experienced tracker would notice. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt. The giant wanted to be followed. This wasn't an escape at all. It was an invitation. The trail led to a small clearing where the canopy opened up, allowing shafts of sunlight to pierce the forest gloom. And there, sitting on a fallen log with his back straight and his massive hands resting on his knees, was the giant. Josiah Freeman looked exactly as Blackwood remembered him, but somehow different. The 8 years of bondage had carved lines into his dark face and streaked his hair with gray, but they hadn't broken him. If anything, he seemed more formidable than ever, a mountain of a man who radiated quiet strength and unshakable resolve. He was wearing the same rough clothes he had worn in the fields, but he had cleaned himself up somehow. His face was washed, his hair combed, his shirt tucked in. He looked like a man preparing for an important meeting, not a desperate fugitive hiding in the woods. "Colonel Blackwood," Josiah said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying easily across the clearing. "I've been waiting for you." Blackwood raised his revolver, but his hand was trembling slightly. In all his years of hunting runaways, he had never encountered anything like this. Fugitive slaves were supposed to be terrified, desperate, broken by their ordeal. They weren't supposed to sit calmly in forest clearings, speaking with the dignity of free men. "You're coming back with me, boy. Dead or alive, but you're coming back." Josiah didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge the gun pointed at his chest. Instead, he looked directly into Blackwood's eyes, something no slave had ever dared to do. "My name," he said quietly, "is Josiah Freeman. Not boy. Not giant. Josiah Freeman." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything Blackwood believed about the natural order of the world. In his experience, slaves who forgot their place were quickly reminded of it through violence and humiliation. But there was something about this man that made such tactics seem suddenly inadequate. "I don't care what you call yourself," Blackwood snarled, trying to regain his authority. "You're my property, and you're coming home." "No," Josiah replied simply. "I'm not." The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Blackwood had heard defiance before, Desperate pleas, angry curses, broken sobs. But he had never heard anything like this calm, absolute refusal. It was spoken with the quiet confidence of a man who had made peace with whatever consequences might follow. "You think because you're big, you can intimidate me." Blackwood's voice rose, echoing off the trees. "I've killed bigger men than you for less than what you've done today." Josiah finally stood, rising to his full height of 7.5 feet. Even at a distance of 20 feet, his presence was overwhelming. The clearing seemed to shrink around him, the very air growing heavy with the weight of his determination. But when he spoke, his voice remained calm, measured, almost gentle. "I'm not trying to intimidate you, Colonel. I'm trying to tell you the truth. I am not your property. I never was. I was born free, and I will die free." The gun trembled in Blackwood's hand as he stared up at the towering figure before him. Every instinct screamed at him to pull the trigger, to end this challenge to his authority before it could spread like wildfire through his plantation and beyond. But something in Josiah's eyes, a depth of conviction he had never encountered, made him hesitate. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the very trees were witnesses to this confrontation between two worlds, two ways of understanding what it meant to be human. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing through the canopy like a warning or perhaps a promise. "You're making a mistake," Blackwood said, his voice hoarse with strain. "Even if you kill me, there are 8 more men out there. They'll hunt you down like a rabid dog. And when they catch you, they'll make you wish you'd never been born." Josiah shook his head slowly, the movement deliberate and sad. "I'm not going to kill you, Colonel. That would make me no better than the men who destroyed my family. Violence begets violence, and I've seen enough of both to last several lifetimes." "Your family." Blackwood laughed bitterly, but there was no humor in the sound. "You mean the wife and children you've been searching for? The ones you'll never find because they're probably dead in some cotton field 1,000 miles from here? Face reality, boy. They're gone." For the first time, Josiah's composure cracked. His massive hands clenched into fists that could crush a man's skull, and a flash of pain crossed his features like lightning across a dark sky. But when he spoke, his voice remained steady, though it carried the weight of years of anguish. Their names were Sarah, Benjamin, and little Mary. Sarah was 26 when they took her, with eyes like starlight and a voice that could make angels weep. Benjamin was 8, smart as a whip, and curious about everything. Mary was 5, with pigtails that bounced when she ran, and a laugh that could light up the darkest room. Blackwood felt a strange sensation in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in years. It took him a moment to recognize it as guilt, an emotion he had thought himself incapable of feeling. "They were sold at auction in Richmond while I was away, trying to earn enough money to buy us a farm in Ohio," Josiah continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I had saved for 3 years, working extra jobs, denying myself everything but the bare necessities. I was so close, Colonel, so close to giving them the life they deserved." "Ancient history," Blackwood said, but his voice lacked conviction. The gun in his hand felt heavier with each passing moment. "No," Josiah replied, his dark eyes blazing with an inner fire. "It's why I'm here. It's why I won't run, and it's why I won't bow. Because somewhere out there, my children might still be alive. And if they are, I want them to know that their father never stopped fighting for his freedom, never stopped believing in the dignity that God gave to every human soul." The sound of approaching horses echoed through the forest, growing louder with each passing second. Pike's voice could be heard calling out, getting closer. Blackwood knew he had only minutes before his men arrived, and then this strange confrontation would end in blood and violence. But something had changed in those few minutes. The certainty that had driven him for 52 years was cracking like ice on a pond in early spring. "You're a fool," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Even if your family is alive, you'll never find them. This country is too big, too broken, and now you'll die for nothing." Josiah reached into his shirt and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, as if it were made of the most precious material on earth, and held it out for Blackwood to see. It was a crude drawing, the kind a child might make, showing 4 figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. "Mary drew this the day before they were taken," Josiah said, his voice soft with memory. "She gave it to me and said, 'Daddy, this is our family. We'll always be together, even when we're apart. I've carried it with me every day for 12 years. Blackwood stared at the drawing, and something inside him began to crack. He thought of his own children, grown now and living in Charleston, and tried to imagine what it would feel like to have them torn away, sold like livestock to the highest bidder. The image was unbearable. 3 weeks ago, Josiah continued, a new slave arrived at your plantation, a young woman named Ruth. She had been sold from a plantation in South Carolina where she met an older woman who had been searching for her husband, a woman named Sarah Freeman. Blackwood's eyes widened. That's impossible. Ruth described her perfectly. The scar on her left hand from when she burned it on a stove as a child. The way she hummed hymns while she worked, always the same 3 songs her mother had taught her. Even the birthmark on her shoulder shaped like a crescent moon. The horses were getting closer. Blackwood could hear Pike shouting orders to the other men, their voices carrying through the trees like the baying of hounds. She's alive, Colonel. My Sarah is alive, less than 200 miles from here, and if she's alive, then maybe. Josiah's voice broke slightly, the first crack in his armor of dignity. Maybe my children are too. Even if that's true, Blackwood said desperately, what does it matter? You'll be dead in 5 minutes. Josiah folded the drawing carefully and put it back in his shirt over his heart. Maybe, but I'll die as a free man, standing on my own 2 feet, and that means something. It means everything. The first horseman burst into the clearing, Pike with his rifle already raised and his face flushed with excitement. Behind him came 3 more men, their weapons drawn and ready, their eyes bright with the prospect of violence. "Well, I'll be damned," Pike said with a grin that revealed tobacco-stained teeth. "Looks like the Colonel found our runaway. Big bastard, ain't he?" "Shoot him," Blackwood ordered, but his voice was weak, uncertain. Pike looked confused, his rifle wavering slightly. "Sir, I said shoot him!" But as Pike raised his rifle, something extraordinary happened. Josiah began to sing. His voice was deep and rich, filling the forest clearing with a sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. It was a spiritual, swing-low, sweet chariot, but sung with such power and conviction that it transformed the simple melody into something transcendent, something that spoke to the deepest parts of the human soul. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. The men with their guns raised found themselves frozen, transfixed by the sound. Even Pike, hardened by years of violence and cruelty, seemed unable to pull the trigger. There was something in that voice that spoke of suffering transformed into strength, of hope that refused to die no matter how dark the world became. As Josiah sang, other voices began to join in from the forest around them, faint at first, then growing stronger, the voices of the enslaved people from Blackwood's plantation who had followed the hunting party at a distance, drawn by some instinct they couldn't name. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see coming for to carry me home? They emerged from the trees, dozens of them, men and women and children, all singing the same spiritual. They formed a circle around the clearing, their voices rising in harmony, creating a wall of sound that seemed to protect the giant at its center. Among them, Blackwood recognized faces he had known for years. Old Martha, who had nursed his own children when they were sick, young Samuel, barely 16, but already showing the scars of hard labor. Rebecca, whose husband had been sold away the previous year, but who had never stopped hoping for his return. They were his property, his slaves, his to command and control. But in this moment, they looked different. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else. Something that looked like hope, like dignity, like the first stirring of a freedom that no chains could hold. "What the hell?" Pike began, but his words were lost in the music. "A band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home." Blackwood looked around at the faces surrounding him. People he had owned, controlled, brutalized for years, but now they looked different. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else, something that looked like hope. "You did this," he said to Josiah. "You planned this." Josiah shook his head, never stopping his song. "I didn't plan anything, Colonel. I just stopped running." The singing continued, growing louder and more powerful with each verse. Blackwood realized that his men were outnumbered 10-1. Surrounded by people who had nothing left to lose, his authority, built on fear and violence, was crumbling before his eyes like a house built on sand. "This is rebellion," he said, his voice barely audible above the singing. "I'll have every one of them hanged." "No," said a new voice, cutting through the music like a blade. "You won't." Everyone turned to see a white man in a dark suit emerging from the forest. He was tall and thin, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Behind him came a dozen men on horseback, but these weren't slave catchers. They wore the uniforms of federal marshals, and their weapons were trained not on the singing slaves, but on Blackwood and his men. "Who the hell are you?" Blackwood demanded, his world tilting on its axis. The man in the suit smiled grimly, pulling out a leather wallet that contained an official badge. "Deputy Marshal William Hayes, United States District Court, and you, Colonel Blackwood, are under arrest." 6 months later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the ruins of Blackwood Plantation. The great house stood empty, its windows boarded up and its fields overgrown with weeds and wildflowers that had reclaimed the land with surprising speed. The slave quarters had been abandoned, their former inhabitants scattered to the four winds. Some heading north to freedom, others searching for family members sold away years before, all of them carrying the memory of the day when everything changed. The federal investigation that followed Josiah's stand in the forest clearing had uncovered a network of corruption that reached from Georgia to Washington, D.C. Blackwood's plantation was just one piece of a larger puzzle. A systematic operation that kidnapped free blacks from northern states and sold them into slavery with forged documents. Deputy Marshal Hayes had been tracking this network for 3 years, following a trail of missing persons reports and suspicious slave sales that led him deep into the heart of the South. Josiah's case had been the key that unlocked everything, providing the evidence needed to bring down not just Blackwood, but dozens of other conspirators. But in the small cemetery behind the plantation chapel, a single figure knelt beside a freshly carved headstone, seemingly oblivious to the historical significance of what had transpired here. Josiah Freeman, no longer called the Giant, placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the grave and bowed his head in prayer. The headstone read, "Thomas Mitchell, born free, died free, 1798-1859. Thomas had been one of the 30 illegally enslaved people discovered during the federal investigation. Unlike Josiah, he had not lived to see his freedom restored. The old man had died of pneumonia just weeks before the marshals arrived, taking with him the knowledge of where his own family might be found and the stories of a lifetime spent in bondage. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you too. Old friend," Josiah whispered, his massive hands gentle as he arranged the flowers. "But your sacrifice wasn't in vain. Your story helped free 30 others, and their stories will free 30 more." Thomas had been more than just another enslaved person on the plantation. In the quiet hours after the day's work was done, he had served as a teacher and storyteller, keeping alive the memories and traditions that slavery sought to destroy. He had taught Josiah about the Underground Railroad, about the network of safe houses and brave souls who risked everything to help others find freedom. More importantly, Thomas had taught him about hope, how to nurture it in the darkest times, how to pass it on to others, how to keep it alive even when everything seemed lost. "Papa?" Josiah turned to see a young woman approaching through the cemetery. She was tall and graceful, with intelligent eyes, and her father's determined chin. At 23, Mary Freeman had grown into a beautiful woman, but Josiah could still see traces of the 5-year-old girl who had drawn pictures of their family. "The wagon's ready," she said softly, her voice carrying the musical quality that had always reminded him of her mother. "Mama's waiting." Josiah stood and embraced his daughter, still marveling at the miracle of having her in his arms again. The search for his family had taken him to 3 states and dozens of plantations, following a trail of records and memories that had seemed impossible to trace. But Deputy Marshal Hayes had been true to his word, using federal resources and the testimony of freed slaves to track down the scattered members of the Freeman family. The reunion had been everything Josiah had dreamed of, and more painful than he could have imagined. 12 years of separation had changed them all, carved new lines into their faces and new scars into their hearts. They were no longer the same people who'd been torn apart in Richmond all those years ago, but they were still family, still bound by love that no amount of suffering could break. They had found Sarah first, working as a house slave on a rice plantation in South Carolina. The years had aged her, carved lines of sorrow into her face and streaked her hair with premature gray. But her spirit remained unbroken, her faith intact. When Josiah walked into that plantation house and spoke her name, she had collapsed into his arms, sobbing with a joy too deep for words. "I knew you'd come," she had whispered against his chest. "I never stopped believing you'd come." Benjamin had been harder to find, sold to a cotton plantation in Alabama. He had grown into a man during his years of bondage. At 20, he was almost as tall as his father, with the same quiet strength and unshakable dignity. But the years had hardened him, built walls around his heart that would take time to tear down. The reunion had been more subdued. Too many years and too much pain lay between them. But the love was still there, waiting to be rebuilt brick by brick. Mary had been the last to be found, working as a seamstress for a wealthy family in Savannah. Unlike her brother, she had been treated relatively well, even taught to read and write by her mistress's daughter. But she had never forgotten her family, never stopped hoping for the day when they would be reunited. "I kept your drawing," she had told Josiah when they first met again. "The one I made when I was little. I hid it in my dress every day, and at night I would look at it and remember what it felt like to be loved." Now, as they prepared to leave Georgia forever, Josiah felt a mixture of joy and sorrow. Joy for his family's freedom, sorrow for all those who would never experience such a reunion. The cemetery around them held dozens of graves, people who had died in bondage, their stories untold, their families scattered to the winds. They walked together toward the main road, where a wagon waited loaded with their few possessions. Sarah sat on the driver's seat, her hair now streaked with gray, but her eyes bright with hope. She wore a simple blue dress that Josiah had bought for her in Savannah, the first new clothing she had owned in 12 years. Benjamin stood beside the wagon, checking the harness one final time. He had grown into a skilled blacksmith during his years of bondage, and his hands showed the calluses and burn scars of his trade. But those same hands had also learned to read and write, taught by a sympathetic overseer who believed that knowledge was the key to freedom. "Where will we go, Papa?" Mary asked, her arm linked through his as they walked. "North," Josiah replied, his voice filled with quiet determination. "To Ohio, like we always planned. I've heard there's good farmland available near Cincinnati, and the Quakers there will help us get started." The Quakers had been instrumental in his family's reunion, providing both financial support and legal assistance. They had also offered him something even more valuable, a community of people who believed in the fundamental equality of all human beings, regardless of the color of their skin. "Will we be safe there?" Mary asked, voicing the fear that haunted all freed slaves. Josiah considered the question carefully. The country was changing. Tensions between North and South were growing stronger every year, and there were rumors of war on the horizon. Even in the free states, black families faced discrimination and violence. Safety was never guaranteed for people like them. "We'll be free," he said finally, "and as long as we're free, we can face whatever comes." And then, as they climbed into the wagon, a rider approached from the direction of town. It was Deputy Marshal Hayes, looking tired but satisfied. He had spent the past 6 months dismantling the network of slave catchers and corrupt officials who had made illegal enslavement possible in this part of Georgia. "Leaving today?" he asked, tipping his hat to Sarah. "Yes," Josiah replied. "It's time." Hayes nodded and reached into his saddlebags. "I wanted to give you this before you go." He handed Josiah an official-looking document sealed with red wax. "Federal Certificate of Freedom. It's signed by a federal judge and carries the seal of the United States government. No one can ever question your status again." Josiah took the document with trembling hands. After 12 years of bondage, he finally had legal proof of what he had always known in his heart, that he was a free man, that his family were free people, that no human being had the right to own another. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." "Thank you," Hayes replied. "Your courage started something here. Word is spreading to other plantations, other counties. People are beginning to understand that they don't have to accept injustice just because it's legal." The marshal's words carried weight beyond their immediate meaning. In the months since Josiah's stand in the forest clearing, there had been other incidents. Slaves refusing to work, demanding better treatment, even attempting escapes in broad daylight. The old order was cracking, and everyone could feel it. As Hayes rode away, Josiah climbed onto the wagon seat beside his wife. Sarah took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, just as they had on their wedding day 25 years before. The years had changed them both, but the love between them remained as strong as ever. "Ready?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with determination. Josiah looked back at the plantation one last time. In the distance, he could see the spot where he had made his stand against Colonel Blackwood, where he had refused to bow. It seemed like a lifetime ago, but he knew he would carry the memory with him forever, not as a burden, but as a reminder of what was possible when a person chose dignity over submission. "Ready?" he said. The wagon rolled forward, carrying the Freeman family toward their new life. Behind them, the sun climbed higher in the Georgia sky, burning away the last of the morning mist and revealing a landscape transformed. The old order was crumbling, and something new was being born in its place. As they reached the main road, Mary began to sing, the same spiritual that had filled the forest clearing 6 months before. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying across the fields where other families were beginning their own journeys toward freedom. "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." Benjamin joined in, then Sarah, and finally Josiah, their voices blending in harmony as the wagon carried them north. They sang of chariots and rivers, of promised lands and freedom's dawn, but mostly they sang of hope, the hope that had sustained them through the darkest years and would guide them toward whatever lay ahead. Behind them, the ruins of Blackwood Plantation grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the Georgia pines. But the story of the giant who would not bow lived on, spreading from plantation to plantation, from state to state, inspiring others to stand up and claim their own freedom. And in the years that followed, as the country tore itself apart and rebuilt itself again, people would remember the day when one man's refusal to submit changed everything. They would tell their children and their children's children about Josiah Freeman, who stood 7.5 feet tall, but whose true strength came not from his size, but from his unshakable belief in human dignity. The Freeman family never looked back. They built their farm in Ohio, raised their children in freedom, and lived to see the day when slavery was abolished forever. But they never forgot the lesson learned in that Georgia clearing, that freedom is not something that can be given or taken away by others. It is something that lives in the human heart, waiting for the moment when someone finds the courage to stand up and say, "I will not bow." 10 years later, as the Civil War raged across America, a young Union soldier named Benjamin Freeman would carry his father's story into battle, and when asked why he fought so fiercely for the freedom of others, he would simply say, "My father taught me that some things are worth more than life itself. Dignity is one of them." The story of the giant who would not bow became legend, passed down through generations as a reminder that even in the darkest times, one person's courage can light the way to freedom for countless others. In 1863, when President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he carried with him a letter from Josiah Freeman, a letter that spoke of the power of human dignity to overcome even the greatest injustices. That letter now rests in the National Archives, a testament to the man who stood 7.5 feet tall, but whose greatest height was measured in courage. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with others who need to hear this message of courage and dignity. History teaches us that freedom is never free. It must be claimed, defended, and passed on to future generations. What will your legacy be? Hit that notification bell so you never miss stories that inspire, educate, and remind us of the power of the human spirit to overcome even the greatest injustices.